For the ancient Greeks, Homer wasn't just some poet. His works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were the absolute bedrock of their culture, their education, their whole identity. To give you some perspective, think about the significance of the Bible in the modern world. Yeah, that's how important Homer was. But here's where the story takes a really fascinating and pretty unexpected turn.
What if the man we credit with creating the cornerstones of Western literature was, well, a myth, a ghost, just a convenient fiction? Now, this isn't some wild conspiracy theory. It's a very real question that has puzzled scholars for generations. And today, we're going to dive right in and investigate it.
Okay, so to get started, let's look at the case against Homer. Why do so many serious academics actually doubt he ever existed? Well, it really boils down to three core arguments that, on the surface, seem pretty convincing.
So the case against Homer kind of rests on these three main pillars. The biggest one is just this deafening silence in the historical record from when he was supposedly alive. Then there's this theory that the poems themselves are way, way older than any single author. And finally, when you really look closely at the two epics, some people argue they just don't feel like they were written by the same person.
Let's really focus on that first point, because it's the biggest hurdle for anyone who believes in Homer. For a guy of such monumental importance, there are zero contemporary accounts. No letters, no legal records, no mentions by other writers from his supposed era, absolutely nothing.
And the sheer scale of this gap is it's staggering. Most scholars traditionally place Homer in the 9th or 8th century BC, but the very first time his name shows up in any written text we found, it's not until the late 7th century BC. We're talking about a gap of 100, maybe even 200 years of silence. In historical terms, that is an eternity, and it's pretty much the foundation for all the doubt.
But hold on. That's just the case for the prosecution, right? Now let's put on our detective hats and take another look at this evidence, because as it turns out, things might not be quite as clear-cut as they seem.
So let's start by challenging that massive 2-century gap. What if the entire premise, this single strongest piece of evidence against Homer, is actually built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the timeline itself? So a lot of that early dating comes from the ancient historian Herodotus. He said Homer lived no more than 400 years before his own time. Now, scholars think he probably got this number by counting back about 10 generations. But here's the thing. He seems to have used a very generous upper limit of 40 years for a generation. Modern historians and anthropologists, they use a much more realistic figure, 25 years. So what happens when you apply that more accurate 25-year model to Herodotus's math? Well, Homer's lifetime suddenly shifts forward, placing him right around 700 BC. And it turns out other ancient writers like Strabo and Theopompus actually agreed with this later date. They put him squarely in the 7th century BC all along. And the result of this simple recalculation is, it's profound. That enormous damning gap of 1 to 2 centuries, it shrinks down to just a few decades. All of a sudden, that first written mention of Homer isn't some ancient echo from centuries later, it's practically a near contemporary account. And just like that, the biggest argument against Homer starts to crumble. Okay, so with the timeline question looking a little shaky, what about the other arguments? Let's tackle that claim that the Iliad and the Odyssey are just too different to have been written by the same person.
Critics like to point to some key differences. Like in the Iliad, the Phoenicians are praised for their beautiful crafts. But in the Odyssey, they're often shown as these treacherous sailors. Or how Achilles seems to welcome a glorious death in the Iliad, but then totally regrets it in the Odyssey. But are these really contradictions, or is it just context? An author could easily shift their perspective based on what the story needs, right? Praising heroic items in one, focusing on seafaring rivalry in another. And as for the claim that the poems use much older material, well, that's what great writers do. They build on the familiar stories and motifs of their time.
And while the debate is still going, there's actually some really strong evidence for a single author. Scholars have found that both poems show a remarkably consistent linguistic style throughout. And not only that, but the specific dialect and vocabulary used in both the Iliad and the Odyssey firmly date them to the exact same historical period. Those two facts together make a really powerful case for one single unifying author.
So, after taking a second look at all the evidence, where do we land? Was Homer a real person? Or was he just a ghost in the literary machine?
The truth is, the debate is far from settled. But what we've seen here is that the major arguments against Homer's existence are surprisingly fragile. That huge timeline gap seems to be based on a pretty simple miscalculation, and the other objections have perfectly plausible explanations. The case for Homer being a total myth, it's not nearly as airtight as it first seems.
And this whole thing leaves us with a bigger, more provocative thought. The mystery of Homer is a great reminder of just how fragile our knowledge of the distant past really is. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other foundational figures of our history are like Homer? These shadowy figures whose reality we just take for granted, all built on stories we can never fully prove.